No one knew his last name. No one knew who booked his ticket. But they were about to find out. Too late. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The first sign that something was off wasn't the stares. Elijah had gotten used to those. It wasn't the half laughs from people who thought they were whispering. It wasn't even the gate agent who scanned everyone else's boarding pass without comment, but paused it is for just a little too long. It was a silence, the kind that wrapped around a person, not to protect, but to erase. He stood quietly in the first-class boarding lane, a soft cotton hoodie zipped to collar, and a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. He didn't wear designer shoes. His sweatpants weren't branded. His haircut was clean but not styled. He looked simple. Too simple for seat 1A. The man behind the counter glanced at the boarding pass, then at Elijah. The pause was subtle, but it registered. Just a moment. The man said, no smile, no welcome. A quick gesture to someone nearby. Within 30 seconds, two uniformed airport security officers walked toward him. One was tall and tired-looking. The other young and tight-jawed. Neither said hello. Sir, can we ask you to step aside for a quick verification? The older one asked, already motioning toward a nearby partition. Elijah didn't argue. He simply stepped out of line. Passengers shifted to let them pass, none making eye contact. Some stared at their phones. A few turned slightly to see more. A woman in a red scarf whispered something to her husband. He nodded like it confirmed something he'd already believed. The officer asked for his ID. Elijah handed it over, then his boarding pass. He gave that too. The officer glanced at both, then tapped into a handheld scanner. Looks like this was flagged. Possibly a booking code mismatch. The younger officer was less careful. He had Elijah's clothes, his shoes, his bag. You're sure this is first class? Yes, Elijah said, calm, even, not defensive, just tired. The scanner beeped once. Then again, then turned green. The older officer frowned. All good here, he muttered. Must have been an internal glitch. But there was no apology, no invitation to return to the line. Just a subtle nod, dismissive. Elijah stepped back into the queue. This time, further back. As he waited, the couple from earlier moved ahead of him. The woman looked over her shoulder, then leaned in and said, just loud enough for him to hear, you'd think with that kind of seat, he'd at least dress like he belonged. Her husband gave a soft chuckle. Elijah didn't look at them. He looked straight ahead. Not because it didn't sting, but because he knew silence could be sharper than any reply. When boarding began, he walked down the jet bridge quietly, stepping into the cabin just as the flight attendants greeted other first-class passengers with champagne flutes and flawless smiles. But not him. The smile given to Elijah was paper-thin, almost like muscle memory. He reached row 1. Seat 1A. He placed his backpack gently under the seat and pulled out a slim leather folder. The only thing he'd carried onto the plane, besides his phone and a book. He sat buckled in and closed his eyes. The man beside him gave a brief glance, then returned to his tablet. A flight attendant paused at their row and handed a seatmate a small towel, then turned, walked away. Elijah got nothing, not even eye contact. 10 minutes passed. The engines hummed to life. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. One by one, attendants moved through the aisle, handing out water, snacks, wine lists. Row 1 received full service. Except for Elijah. The same attendant passed by again, offering drinks to the couple in 1B and 1C. She didn't stop, didn't ask, didn't even pretend to. The man beside Elijah looked confused. Aren't drinks free in first? He muttered. Elijah didn't answer. Not because he didn't have a response, but because he'd already had this conversation before. In different places, in different ways. He looked out the window. The city below faded into soft grays as the plane climbed. Somewhere between clouds and judgment, he let out a slow breath. He knew what this was. A test, not of patience, but of presence. The kind of test that didn't come with a warning. It came with smirks, with skip trays, with questions asked just a bit too loudly. with officers called before anyone thought to ask his name. Elijah wasn't a stranger to this game. He just usually didn't play it at 30,000 feet. A sharp voice cut across the cabin. "Ma'am, your carry-on needs to be under the seat or overhead." It was directed at a woman 3 rows back, but the volume made it clear. Everyone was being watched. Everyone, except him, it seemed. He was being handled. He leaned back, fingers brushing the leather folder in his lap. Inside was a sealed document with a signature no one on this plane would expect, and a name they'd all recognize if they saw it in print. But Elijah wasn't here to drop names. He was here to see how far the system would go to push him out before it realized whose son it was trying to erase. He didn't look it. He didn't act like it. And that was the point. He wasn't here to belong. He was here to remember. And someone very soon was about to remember him. The line for boarding had barely started when Elijah felt the shift. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. One glance from the gate agent, a barely masked flicker of judgment, was all it took. A quick scan of his sneakers, the simple black hoodie, and the silence with which he waited. The man behind the counter, a neatly pressed name tag reading Brad, tilted his head slightly and forced a tight smile that never touched his eyes. "Excuse me, young man," he said, as if correcting a mistake. "Boarding for first class is only for priority passengers." Elijah said nothing at first. He simply raised his phone, the digital boarding pass already glowing on the screen. 1A. The number sat quietly between them like a challenge. Brad blinked, hesitated, then scanned the pass with a frown that tightened with every beep. "Strange," he muttered. "This seat is, never mind. You can go ahead." But as Elijah took a step forward, Brad leaned to whisper something to his colleague. It wasn't quiet enough. Probably a standby mix-up. Or someone pulled a favor. He said, the kind of voice that made it clear he didn't think Elijah belonged there at all. Elijah kept walking. Not fast, not angry, but with the quiet poise of someone who knew this wasn't the first time and wouldn't be the last. Behind him, a man in a navy suit, holding a silver briefcase, didn't even pause. Brad didn't scan his pass, just waved him through with a nod. The contrast hung in the air, sharp as glass. Inside the aircraft, the story didn't change. A flight attendant in a red scarf, blonde hair tied back, so tightly it seemed to hold her whole posture together, watched Elijah as he approached the seat. "Good morning," she said, but not to him. Her voice was meant for the passenger behind. Elijah slid into seat 1A without a word. His movements were calm, unbothered, but his eyes didn't miss a thing. Across the aisle, champagne was offered. Warm towels distributed. A tray of mint-scented cloths passed from one hand to the next, skipping him completely. The red scarf attendant glanced at him once more, then continued down the aisle, her smile returning as she spoke to a man in seat 2B. Elijah didn't react. He just reached into his small backpack, pulled out a notebook, plain black, with a corner slightly bent, and placed it on the tray table in front of him. The plane continued to fill. The sound of designer bags thumping into overhead compartments, of passengers laughing softly about conference calls and golf retreats, filled the cabin like static. A woman walked past Elijah's row, then paused and doubled back. She stared at him, confused, then turned to the flight attendant. "Is this first class?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," came the answer. The woman nodded slowly, then walked off, but not without a second glance over her shoulder, as if still unsure that someone like him could occupy that space. Just before the door closed, Sloan boarded. The lead flight attendant. Her walk was practiced, clipped heels clicking with the authority of someone who had memorized every step of power. She took a single look at Elijah, then turned to whisper to the junior staff. Something short, something that made the red scarf attendant frown for just a second before nodding. Elijah's tray table was quietly removed. The champagne never came. The menu skipped his lap. Instead, he got the look, the one that said, "We're watching you." The man beside him, early 50s, salt and pepper beard, tapped on his tablet and offered a distracted smile. "Traveling alone?" he asked, voice casual. Elijah nodded once. "Always." The man didn't ask more. Maybe he sensed something, or maybe he didn't care. But Sloan did. She walked past again, her eyes sliding across Elijah's seat like he was a misfiled item. She whispered again, and minutes later, another uniformed staff member appeared. "Mr. Riley?" he asked. Elijah turned, his face unreadable. "We had a seating concern flagged by ground control." The man continued. "Would you mind showing your ID again?" Elijah didn't argue. He reached calmly into his backpack, pulled out a slim leather wallet, and presented the same boarding pass again. Same seat, same name. The man scanned it, frowned, then forced a smile. Must have been a system error. Apologies. No apology came from Sloane. Only silence as she walked past for the third time, this time offering a cloth napkin, again, to everyone except him. Elijah looked out the window. He didn't need the champagne, didn't want the meal, but he'd noticed every move, every pause, every skip detail, and whispered remark. The difference wasn't in how loud the discrimination was. It was in how routine it had become. They weren't trying to remove him. Not yet. They were trying to make him uncomfortable enough to move on his own. As the engine roared to life and the cabin lights dimmed, Sloane passed by one last time and said it softly. "We may need you to switch to a different seat for balance." The lie was smooth, professional. Elijah didn't respond right away. He turned, eyes steady. "I'm balanced just fine," he said, then looked back out the window. The smile dropped from Sloane's lips. The man next to Elijah looked up from his tablet, confused by the exchange. But Elijah wasn't looking for reactions. He was listening for the silence that always followed a system trying to cover itself. And outside, 30,000 feet below, the real weight was already shifting. Not in the cabin, not in the tray tables, but in the boardrooms where decisions were made. Elijah wasn't there to enjoy the flight. He was there to finish something that had been planned for months. And every skip towel, every whispered order, every suspicious glance was exactly what they needed to prove. The plane had reached cruising altitude when the mood shifted from discomfort to hostility. It began with turbulence, not from the air outside, but from inside the cabin. Sloane returned with a clipboard, her voice now clipped and brisk. "Mr. Riley," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We had a report from another guest that you may have accessed a restricted file on the in-flight network." Elijah looked up, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," he replied calmly. Sloane didn't blink. "Our system logs unusual activity. For passenger safety, we may need to inspect your device." The accusation was baseless. Elijah hadn't even connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi. But the words weren't meant to be true. They were meant to sound official, to plant a seed of suspicion. The man next to Elijah shifted slightly in his seat, now eyeing him with quiet caution. Sloane waited. Elijah slowly closed his notebook, set it on his lap, and looked her in the eyes. "You're making a mistake," he said. Sloane didn't flinch. "That's not for you to decide, Mr. Riley." Another passenger across the aisle began recording discreetly on her phone, not because she knew Elijah, but because something about this didn't sit right. Sloane extended her hand. "Your device, please." Elijah didn't move. "I've done nothing wrong," he said, "and I'm not handing over private property without cause." That's when it escalated. Sloane turned and gestured. Two uniformed crew members entered the cabin. One male, tall and built like security. The other younger, eyes nervous but obedient. "Sir, we'll need you to come with us," the taller one said, his voice rehearsed. Elijah slowly stood, not in defiance, not in submission, but like someone who had lived this moment in his mind long before it arrived. He tucked his notebook under his arm, adjusted his backpack, and walked silently down the aisle between rows of eyes, half curious, half already judging. Sloane followed behind like a prosecutor escorting her case. They stopped at the back of the first-class cabin, where a small galley space offered enough privacy to isolate him from view. Sloane stepped closer. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are," she said quietly, "but your attitude doesn't fly up here. You want to sit in first class. You show some respect. This isn't a public bus." Elijah stared at her. His voice was calm, but something deeper settled behind it now. "You don't know who I am," he said, "and that's exactly why you should be careful. Sloane scoffed. Is that a threat? She snapped. Because if it is, I can have federal air marshals meet us when we land. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any outburst could have been. Sloane leaned in, her voice low and sharp. You think you're entitled to something. But let me tell you, people like you don't just get handed things because you showed up with a fancy boarding pass. The world doesn't work like that. That was the moment she made a mistake. A deep, irreversible mistake. She reached forward and snatched the notebook from Elijah's hands. The thin elastic band snapped from its corner as she ripped it open and flipped through the pages. Her eyes scanned the content, confusion flickering across her face. Page after page of diagrams, legal codes, signatures, logos. A formal header on one page read Division of Aviation Oversight, Office of Strategic Governance. At the bottom, in bold, was a stamped signature, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Her throat tightened. She slammed the notebook shut and shoved it back into his chest. You think printing fake documents is going to scare me? She whispered. I've dealt with wannabes before. Elijah took the notebook silently, but he didn't walk away. He said something instead. Quietly, clearly. You just committed a federal offense. Congratulations. Sloane blinked. Excuse me? You just open and tamper with an oversight officer's classified field dossier, he said. Without a warrant, without consent, on a recorded flight, and in front of witnesses. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Her face went pale. What are you talking about? She whispered. Elijah stepped slightly closer. Do you even know who owns this airline? Sloane stammered. The board, private shareholders, no. Elijah said, my grandfather does. Or rather, his investment firm does. 74% controlling interest, which makes you, technically, a contractor under my family's governance. He paused. You should sit down, Ms. Sloane, before this gets worse. But Sloane didn't sit down. She stepped back, then forward, and in one swift, chaotic moment, she slapped him. It wasn't just a reflex. It wasn't hidden. The sound echoed against the galley walls and was heard in the row behind. 2 passengers gasped. 1 woman dropped her drink. Elijah stood completely still, the red mark on his cheek already blooming. Sloane's hand trembled. She realized at the moment after, the silence was too heavy. The camera was still rolling from the aisle. The man who had recorded earlier now stood. I got that, he said aloud, not to her, but to the phone in his hand. Sloane backed away, panic rising in her eyes. You were being aggressive. He threatened me. But no one believed her. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't even touch his cheek. He just turned slightly toward the back of the plane, where a figure had now quietly stepped into view. A tall man, broad-shouldered, wearing no uniform, just a dark coat and a stare that made the air feel colder. Sloane followed Elijah's gaze. And the moment she saw the face of the man now walking toward them, her knees buckled slightly, because she knew that face. Everyone did. The silence in the rear galley of the plane felt like a vacuum. Even the hum of the engine seemed to retreat as the man in the dark coat approached. Passengers craned their necks, whispers swelling like a slow tide. Sloane stood frozen, her breath shallow, one hand still trembling from the slap she had delivered seconds earlier. Elijah didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stepped aside. The tall man took his place. Arnold Schwarzenegger stood face to face with Sloane, his expression unreadable. Not angry, not loud, just terrifying in how still he was. His presence didn't need introduction. It didn't need volume. It carried history. Wait, and right now, it carried something else, disappointment. Sloane opened her mouth, unsure whether to apologize, defend herself, or run. She did none of those things, because Arnold spoke first. His voice wasn't raised. It was calm, level, and somehow colder than yelling could ever be. Who taught you to treat people this way? The question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't theatrical. It was genuine. It cut deeper than any accusation. Sloane blinked. Mr. Schwarzenegger, I didn't know he said things. He said nothing. Arnold interrupted. He's my grandson. But even if he weren't, you still would have been wrong. A flight attendant tried to intervene, stepping forward with a clipboard. Sir, we're trying to resolve this. Arnold turned his head, just slightly, and the attendant stepped back without another word. No orders, just presence. He returned his gaze to Sloane. I built my life on discipline, he said. Respect, integrity. I know what power looks like. And what you did was not power. Sloane's eyes welled up, but not with regret, with fear. Her composure cracked, and the mask of superiority she wore for so long finally slipped. Please, she whispered. This will ruin me. Arnold tilted his head. You ruined yourself. All I did was watch. Behind them, the man with the phone camera continued recording, not for revenge, not for clicks, but because he knew this moment would matter. Sloane glanced toward him, then to the cabin, where passengers were no longer pretending to ignore what was happening. They were watching, quietly, intently, and they were remembering. Arnold turned slightly toward Elijah. Are you okay? Elijah nodded once. She opened my case file, slapped me. Arnold's jaw tightened, barely. I saw. There was a pause. Only a few seconds, but enough for Sloane to feel the collapse of everything she thought she controlled. And then Arnold turned to the man with the camera. May I? The man handed over his phone. Arnold held it up, looked directly into the lens, and said only one sentence. This is how an empire ends. Not with a bang, but with arrogance. Then he stopped the recording, handed the phone back, and turned to Elijah. Get your seat back. We'll be landing soon. Sloane opened her mouth again. Mr. Schwarzenegger, I can explain. No, he said, sharp this time. You can't. And you won't. When we land, you'll wait here. You're not going anywhere until federal security debriefs you. But I already contacted them, he said. You'll have time to reflect. She staggered backward, almost bumping into the beverage cart. No one reached out to help her. Elijah picked up his notebook from the counter, the pages slightly bent where Sloane had gripped them too hard. He held it close this time, not out of fear, but respect. That notebook was more than paper. It was legacy, proof of trust, of responsibility, and now a violation. Arnold placed a hand gently on his grandson's back as they walked forward together. The cabin parted like a wave. First class no longer whispered. They watched in silence. Some nodded, some looked away in shame, remembering how easily they had judged Elijah only an hour earlier. But most simply watched as truth walked past them in silence. Back in his seat, Elijah exhaled. The pressure was gone, but the bruises, emotional and physical, lingered. Arnold didn't sit next to him. He stayed standing, arms folded, eyes forward, like a wall, a shield, a grandfather. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for arrival. As passengers obeyed, Arnold leaned down beside Elijah. You handled that better than I would have at your age. Elijah gave a faint smile. I've had good examples. You'll need that, Arnold said, because this isn't the end. It's the beginning. Elijah looked out the window. The city grew larger beneath the clouds. What happens next, he asked. Arnold stood straight. Justice, he said simply. The kind people remember. Far behind them, Sloane remained in the rear galley, shoulders hunched, eyes blank. The cameras were off now, but the damage was already done. Her name had changed, no longer a figure of quiet dominance, but a warning. And as the wheels lowered and the cabin lights flickered with landing procedures, one truth became clear. The slap had echoed, but what followed would roar. The plane's wheels screeched softly against the tarmac, but inside, silence still reigned. No one clapped. No one spoke. The echo of what had just unfolded 30,000 feet in the air had drained the cabin of small talk and pretense. The moment the seatbelt sign dinged off, passengers didn't leap to their feet like usual. They waited, not out of fear, but out of respect. Elijah remained seated. His hands rested calmly on his notebook, the pages now smoothed by careful fingers. Across the aisle, Arnold stood still, eyes steady on the front of the cabin. He wasn't moving either, not until they called for him. A discreet knock tapped against the cockpit door, and within moments, the lead flight attendant walked swiftly down the aisle with two men behind her. Plainclothes federal officers, badges on their belts, eyes already scanning the passengers. They didn't make an announcement. They didn't need to. They moved with precision, heading straight to the galley. From the rear of the plane came the slow shuffle of Sloane's footsteps. Her hair was no longer immaculate, her blazer wrinkled. Her presence, once commanding, had collapsed into something smaller, almost spectral. One of the agents nodded toward Arnold, who gave a slight nod in return. Passengers watched as Sloane was quietly escorted out the rear door, away from the terminal jet bridge. A second vehicle waited for her on the tarmac. Not a police cruiser, but a black government SUV. The kind that didn't flash lights, but still meant your life was about to change. Forever. As the forward doors opened and passengers finally began filing out, conversations sparked like dry twigs catching flame. Whispers turned into hurried recounts, retellings, opinions, judgments, all orbiting the same center. The boy, the woman, the man who stood. But Elijah and Arnold didn't exit with the crowd. They waited. The crew had been instructed. A private transport was arranged. Outside, beneath the terminal's belly, a silver government vehicle idled with tinted windows and quiet authority. Inside, Elijah leaned against the seat, the first traces of fatigue beginning to settle behind his eyes. Arnold sat beside him, reviewing something on his phone. A message had come in, not a news report, though those had already started trickling online, but a private note from a contact. "It's not just going viral," Arnold said quietly. "It's setting off alarms. Airline execs, legal teams, even Capitol staffers. Sloane wasn't just anyone. She was tied to people in places that don't like being embarrassed." Elijah looked up, confused. "Is that bad?" Arnold shook his head slowly. "It's necessary. People like her live behind curtains. No accountability. Until a moment like this tears it all open, and they'll scramble to sew it back shut. But not this time." The car pulled up to a secure executive lounge on the far side of the airport. No reporters. No chaos. Just a tall man in a blue suit waiting with a folder in hand. Elijah recognized the seal. Department of Transportation. The man stepped forward, introduced himself without theatrics, and addressed Arnold first. "Mr. Schwarzenegger, we're aware of your prior advisory roles. Off the record, we're glad you were there." Arnold didn't nod. He simply said, "What's the process?" The man handed him the folder. "We're opening an inquiry. Internal first, but there will be consequences. Sloane's actions violated multiple FAA codes and federal non-discrimination statutes. We'll need statements." From Elijah to... Elijah stepped forward. "I can give you my notebook. It has everything." The official looked surprised but impressed. "You kept notes." Arnold smiled faintly. "He keeps more than notes. He carries legacy." They entered a side room where Elijah gave his statement clearly, without embellishment, without bitterness. Just truth, the kind that didn't need polishing, the kind that landed like a hammer on marble. Later that evening, while seated in a quiet corner of Arnold's Los Angeles home, Elijah scrolled through his phone. Social media was ablaze, not just with outrage, but reflection. Teachers were sharing the clip in classrooms. Veterans had begun commenting in solidarity. Parents talked about how proud they'd be to raise a son like him. And then there was the other side, the silence from Sloane's allies. Her colleagues, her contacts. No defense, no justifications. Just the slow sound of doors closing behind her. Arnold returned from the kitchen, carrying 2 mugs of tea, the kind he always brewed when things felt heavy. He placed one beside Elijah and sat down. "Tomorrow it gets louder," he said. "There will be cameras, questions. People will try to own your story." Elijah nodded. "So what do I do?" Arnold looked him in the eyes. "You own it first, with truth, with calm, and with strength. That's how we break cycles." For the first time since the slap, Elijah leaned back and smiled. Not because things were over, but because he knew they were just beginning. He didn't ask for this moment. He didn't chase it. But now that it was here, he would rise to it, with his grandfather beside him, with the world watching, and with the weight of a new name being etched not just in news feeds, but in history. By dawn, the apology had been posted, but not by the airline. It was a handwritten letter, black ink on ivory paper, scanned, signed, dated, from Elijah, addressed not to the executives, or even Sloan, but to the millions of silent eyes watching. You watched her slap me. Some of you flinched. Some of you looked away. Some of you did nothing. I understand why. I've done the same before. But I won't anymore. And I hope next time neither will you. The letter spread like fire, not through headlines, but through hearts. Teachers printed it for their classrooms. Parents taped it to fridges. Soldiers in airports saved it to their phones. Because it said what many felt but couldn't find the words for. And it came from a boy they almost missed. But not everyone celebrated. That morning, a segment aired on a national network. This is performative victimhood, barked one suited panelist. It's a slap, not a tragedy. And Schwarzenegger's just capitalizing on his name. Another added, we're raising a generation of kids who think feelings are stronger than facts. The clip was harsh, deliberately edited. The host had laughed. Arnold should stick to movies, not lectures. It was trending within the hour. Back in their home, Elijah was quiet, not because he was hurt, but because he wasn't surprised. It doesn't matter what I say. They'll twist it. Arnold sat across from him, eyes locked, face calm. Then don't say anything. Show them. How? Arnold opened a drawer. Inside was an old box, mahogany, heavy. Inside, a gold medallion rested on velvet. The International Inspiration Award, presented to Arnold years ago after funding schools in war zones. You know why I never put this on display? Elijah shook his head. Because people don't follow medals. They follow moments. They follow how you made them feel. So if you want to change the story, give them a moment they can't deny. That night, the board of the airline announced a press conference for the following morning. Not because they were ready, but because pressure had mounted beyond control. Shareholders were restless. Staff were protesting. Thousands of letters had arrived from veterans, teachers, and passengers. One handwritten note read, I served with your pilot on flight 716. He looked ashamed when it happened. I hope you let him speak too. The press conference was set in a neutral auditorium. No logos, no banners. Just a long table, 7 microphones, 1 flag. The media was invited. Elijah and Arnold were not. But they came anyway. As executives shuffled toward the stage, a hush fell. Cameras clicked. Reporters murmured. And then the door opened, and in walked Elijah, flanked by Arnold. No security. No lawyers. Just a notebook and presence. The room froze. The board members glanced at each other. Some panicked. Some whispered, but Elijah kept walking, down the center aisle, right up to the stage. He didn't ask permission. He didn't raise his voice. He just took one of the 7 microphones and began. My name is Elijah. You know that already. What you don't know is what happened before that slap. The comments, the seat assignment change, the tone. I could list every detail, but I won't, because this isn't about proving I'm right. It's about proving I matter. That people like me matter. The room didn't breathe. I'm not asking you to resign. I'm not asking for lawsuits. I'm asking you to remember that the kid you almost ignored stood here, without a lawyer, without a title, without a PR team, and told the truth. And if I can do that, so can you. He stepped back, placed the mic down. Arnold didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. But then someone else rose. Captain Delaney. The pilot from flight 716. He cleared his throat, voice trembling. I flew that plane. I heard the slap. I saw the look on Elijah's face. And I should have done more. I didn't. I apologize. I'm saying this as a father, a veteran, a man who failed in that moment. But I won't again. The room shifted. One executive began to clap. Then another. Then the audience rose, not in applause, but in something quieter. Respect. Outside, cameras caught the moment the door opened and Elijah stepped back into sunlight. Reporters swarmed. Questions flew. Will you sue? Will there be a Netflix deal? Did Arnold coach you? Elijah just looked into the lens of one camera and said, I didn't write this for fame. I lived it. That single sentence would go on to be the headline. Arnold walked beside him, quiet, proud, and for the first time, he didn't shield Elijah from the microphones, because he knew this boy didn't need a shield anymore. He had become one. That night, no words were spoken over dinner, just clinking forks, warm light, and something unspoken between them. Legacy wasn't what Arnold passed down. It was what Elijah stood up and created. And the world saw it, not because they were told, but because they couldn't look away. The hallway was quiet now. No cameras, no reporters, just a heavy echo of Elijah's steps as he walked beside Arnold to the back corridor of the auditorium. The walls were plain, lined with decades of forgotten awards and dusty frames that once mattered to someone. Elijah didn't look at them. He was too tired. But not from walking, from holding back everything he had carried for weeks. Arnold didn't speak, but his presence was solid, like a wall that never leaned, never cracked, just stood with you through the worst. They reached the side exit. The sun was already slipping behind the skyline, casting long gold shadows on the pavement. A crowd waited on the other side of the gate, not with chants or picket signs, but with silence. That strange kind of silence that says more than applause ever could. They saw him now, not as a symbol, not as the boy who got slapped, but as a young man who stood tall where others would have crumbled. A small girl in the front row held out a drawing. Crayon colors, uneven lines, a cape. You're my hero, she whispered. Elijah took it without a word, just a small nod, and a smile that didn't reach his lips but filled his chest. They stepped into the car. The doors shut gently, like the closing of a chapter. Arnold drove. No music, just the soft rhythm of tires on the road. Halfway home, Elijah finally spoke. I thought I'd feel different. Arnold didn't ask what he meant. He just waited. I thought once I stood up there, once I said it all, something would change inside me. But it didn't. I'm still just me. Arnold kept his eyes on the road. That's the point. You need to change. They did. The car pulled into the driveway. The house was dark but peaceful. Elijah stepped out first. But as he reached the door, he paused. His phone buzzed. A message from someone unexpected. Sloan. 3 words. I saw everything. No apology. No anger. No attempt to explain. Just those words. And for some reason, they were enough. Not because they made things better, but because they meant she had watched. And she knew. That night, Elijah sat in his room. Lights off. Window cracked open. The world still humming outside. He scrolled through the letter he had written again, not as the author, but as a reader. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just exhaled. And for the first time in days, it felt like he could finally breathe without permission. Downstairs, Arnold stood by the fireplace. In his hand was a photo, faded, curled at the edges. Elijah as a toddler. Sitting on his shoulders, both of them covered in paint from a failed art project. Back then, no one knew who Elijah would become, and Arnold had no idea how to be a father. But he had promised one thing, to never let his son forget his worth. Not with words, but with action. The next morning, something strange happened. The airline CEO resigned, not with a press release, not on a stage, but through a personal letter posted on the company's site. She didn't mention Elijah by name. She didn't have to. She spoke of culture, silence, complicity. She said the company needed younger voices at the table, ones who had something to say, and the courage to say it. 2 days later, Elijah received a call from a foundation. They wanted him to speak at an upcoming event about youth leadership and dignity. He declined the first offer, then the second, not because he was bitter, but because he wasn't ready to become anyone's poster boy. He didn't want to be the face of trauma. He wanted to finish his school year, walk through hallways without whispers, Laugh without people asking for quotes. Be normal. For a while, Arnold supported that. Fully. But he had one request. That Elijah come with him to a small town a few hours north. No reason. Just a visit. They arrived in the late afternoon. A quiet place with more trees than streetlights. Arnold parked in front of a modest building with a stone sign that read Veterans Youth Center. Inside, children of all backgrounds trained together. Boxing, reading, debating. They all paused when Elijah entered. Arnold whispered, I funded this place years ago, but I never named it. He stepped aside. The instructor, a tall woman with a military posture and kind eyes, walked over and placed her hand on Elijah's shoulder. They know who you are, she said softly. They've watched every second. Not because you were loud, but because you stood your ground. That matters more than most people will ever admit. And just like that, Elijah realized something. Maybe change didn't come from viral views or trending hashtags. Maybe it came in moments like this. Quiet ones, with no cameras, where a kid looked up and saw that you didn't flinch when it got hard, that you didn't sit down when it got lonely, that you told the truth even when the world twisted it. That night, as they drove home under a sky full of stars, Elijah leaned his head against a window. Thanks, Dad, he said, almost a whisper. Arnold smiled, eyes still on the road. You don't have to thank me. Elijah looked over. I know. I just wanted to. And the road stretched ahead, long and open, like the kind of future that isn't handed down, but earned. Bạn đã muốn bắt đầu chương một thay mốc kết ra for cái mình his father was Arnold Schwarzenegger 900 từ, chứ? Mình đã sẵn sàng viết theo đúng tôn điện ảnh, sâu sắc, không đoán trước đúng chuẩn chịu view.